Hello everyone, welcome to our first lecture for HAVC 70 online. This lecture will be discussing ideas of Indigenous knowledge versus European visions of oceanic visual culture, primarily kind of giving an overview of colonial contact starting in the 16th century, moving into the 19th century, and the kinds of images that were created and also collected during this period. Then the last part of the lecture, I'll be discussing some contemporary artists from Aotearoa, New Zealand, who are creating images in response to colonial images. So we'll discuss some of the kind of visual resistance to the colonial archive. So beginning with a map, this is Oceania, the region of Oceania, in the three subregions, Micronesia, Melanesia, and Polynesia. And for this lecture, I'll be kind of discussing this region more broadly. And one important quote by a famous scholar named Vilsoni Hereniko from the island of Rotuma. I actually assigned an article for you guys this week by him. He states, "A stereotypical cultural identity once stuck is almost impossible to shake off." And so this kind of references some of the themes that I'll be discussing in this lecture, that the kind of harms and the dangers of what stereotypical images do to communities such as Oceania, within Oceania. And so thinking towards the kinds of groups of people that visited Oceania, there's a variety of types of colonialism. So colonialism is very diverse. It's not one thing, but it's many things. So some of the reasons that people visited the region was for science and exploration, missionary projects, colonial interest, tourism or travel, anthropological and archaeological study. And even Pacific Islanders themselves were traveling across the region, either on European vessels or on their own vessels throughout different islands. The types of written texts and documents that came out during this era were scientific descriptions and analyses, journals, travel accounts, letters, popular literature, documents of colonial administrators, but then also, and important to this class, are the visual texts. So we have paintings, sketchbooks, photographs that were produced by travelers and scholars, and then of course art collections, so different artworks, sculptures, regalia that were collected by colonial figures and brought back to Europe or the US, and then placed in museums. So all these kinds of texts and sources really must be regarded very critically, and we should be kind of asking critical questions such as what was collected, why was it collected, and what were the purposes of these collections? What did the colonial figures use these collections for? What were their agendas? So thinking about the ways and reasons why people collected, or the reasons why people were creating images, we can ask the questions of what lens were they seeing the Pacific through, or what lens were they seeing culture through? And this is a really poignant image. The image on the left is by Sidney Parkinson of a Maori man with his tamoko, or his facial tattoos. And if you compare it to the image on the right, which is a photograph of a Maori chief with tamoko, you can see how intricate the photo is, how the lines and the crevices are very detailed in comparison to Sidney Parkinson's photo that kind of lacks that detail. And so for Sidney Parkinson, or for a European who's coming to a place like Aotearoa, New Zealand, and they're seeing these spiral tattoos, for them it may just be a shape or lines, but for a Maori person, these lines and shapes have very specific meaning. And so for Sidney Parkinson, his drawing of the Maori chief is really lacking detail and accuracy. So it makes us wonder, why was he creating this image and for what purpose? Now, explorations in the Pacific began in 1521. Now, a lot of people associate colonialism in the Pacific with James Cook, who's probably the most popular and famous European explorer in the region. But in fact, the Spanish and Portuguese were the first to enter this region, primarily in 1521 to 1767. But then it was in 1578 that the British began exploring this region. And they were involved in the Pacific exploration, first starting with Francis Drake's expedition, and he was ordered to plunder any Spanish holdings of this area. And so after Drake, we have Dampier, and then Wallace, and then comes Cook in 1769 and 1770s. So Captain Cook, is an example of an enlightened Englishman. He was interested in the historical and scientific study through material culture and natural history. And it's this point that kind of has made Cook so famous and well known, is that he did have a strong interest in collecting, and he had a strong interest in recording what he saw. So in order to promote techniques of objective observation, and what he called objective observation and recording, also known as empiricism, so studying through the act of looking, he trained scientists and professional artists on his voyage. So on every voyage, he would bring an artist who would just focus on collecting data and drawing images that offered insights into the different encounters they had throughout the Pacific. So just to kind of give an overview of some of the artists that he brought on his voyages, his first voyage, Sidney Parkinson was the main artist from 1768 to 71. And then the second voyage, William Hodges was the main artist, 1772 to 1775. And then the third voyage was John Webber from 1776 to 1778. And we'll look into some of the images that they created momentarily. But it's also important to ask why there is an interest in collecting and curiosities, and also documenting the curiosities. And so when I say curiosities, I mean objects from the Pacific that were framed as curiosities. So these objects were part of a scientific mission to learn about the world from direct and careful observation. So it was understood to be important to studying the history of humanity, or its origins and evolutions, by collecting these different things and understanding it within the framework of evolution. So since the Pacific had not been in contact with Europeans, they and their materials formed a good source of information about the origins of art and civilization. Now I put that in quotes, origins of art and civilization, because this is a severe misunderstanding of what these objects are, as something that is very simplistic and archaic or primitive, but in reality many of the things that they're creating were highly technical, highly advanced artifacts and technologies that were coming out of this region. But again, these were kind of considered to be more so part of the origins, more so than, say, the ancient Greek, Roman, or Asian art, because of the history of contact. So many of the images that were produced on Cook's voyages and other voyages remained influential and popularized the Pacific into the 19th century and even into the present. So this wallpaper that we're looking at in this slide is an example of a very popular and pervasive image of the idealized visions of the Pacific. So if we see the wallpaper in its entirety, it's spans the entire region of the Pacific, covers different regions, different landscapes, and attempts to kind of portray who the Pacific people are. We're going to look a little bit more into this image later on in the lecture, but I do just want to kind of discuss the kinds of images that were being created and for what agenda. So this one that we're looking at now is a slide of John Webber's Human Sacrifice of Tahiti from 1780s, and next to it a black and white woodcut version of the same image that was published in the Missionary Sketches in 1837. So these images, of course, were not always faithful. Sometimes they were edited with different impressions and different interpretations. And the missionaries, for example, as many other explorers, adapted their own needs and goals within the narrative of the image. And so if we look at a detail of this image by Webber, we can see that he presents a sacrificial ritual of Tahiti. The bodies are depicted as heroic, the subject matter is rendered with scientific observation, and it makes this image look real and realistic. But we can see very specific visual modalities that are being utilized in the image. For one, the native populations are portrayed as nude, just wearing a loincloth and shirtless. Whereas on the right-hand side of the image, we can see a colonial figure. He is fully clothed, and he seems to be directing this group of people. And so through this dichotomy of the nude and the clothed, we start to begin to understand some of the agendas in this particular image. And it was these sorts of images and these sorts of visual narratives that invented the ignoble savage, a pictorial type from the 19th century. So the ignoble savage indicates the abject state of the natives and the moral duties of the Christians. It connoted spiritual darkness and paganism in need of civilizing influence. So again, we can see in a little bit more detail in this image the ways in which the dynamics between the native populations and the colonial figures are being depicted. And even more so, or as another example, we can see a similar kind of narrative structure that is being portrayed in these images of the Cook Islands from The Life in the Southern Isles by Reverend W.W. Gile from 1876. So the image on the top represents the unredeemed savages as objects of pity and dislike. And we can see that there's a bit of disorganization in the way that people are composed in the image. They are wearing regalia. It's a ritual, but it's an over-exaggerated ritual. So there's no uniform there's no uniform in the way that the image is being narrated. Whereas the image on the bottom is meant to show the progress of the missionary project. So we see Western houses, we see paved roads, people are clothed, there's a bit more organization. We can see people on the left-hand side who are gardening. And so this image showed the evidence of the missionary agenda working in the Pacific Islands. Moving into another type of image referencing the Dusky Maiden. And for this week, I assigned a reading by Marata Taimira entitled Representing the Dusky Maiden. And in this article, she discusses the history of this type of image called the Dusky Maiden. And she characterizes 3 different categories in the article that distinguish the way that the female body is represented in the Pacific. The first category she calls the female gods, the power and the agency of women in the Polynesian pantheon. And so she looks at oral stories, mythological stories of powerful Pacific figures and the kinds of narratives that were told about women in these mythological stories. The second category she calls the concealment of female power. And it was in this period of contact, the colonial contact that I've been talking about previously in this lecture, that Western artists painted over the agency and power of Polynesian women and represent an exotic and vulnerable maiden. And then the third category she discusses is female power, representing the Dusky Maiden. And she looks at several artists from Aotearoa, New Zealand, contemporary artists who are responding to the colonial legacies of representation of women and the concealment of female power. So one of the images she discusses is entitled Tahiti Revisited by William Hodges from 1776. And if we do a bit of visual analysis of this image, we can see it's a landscape painting with light-filled skies. There's swaying coconut trees and large mountains in the background. And in the foreground, we can see voluptuous nude bodies on the right-hand side of the painting. And then also one woman who's swimming in the waters. And above them is a ti'i, or a god image. And what is significant about this image is that William Hodges is using a scientific painting technique, or a realist painting technique, to portray a fictional narrative of Tahiti. So although the landscape may look very real, the imagery is fictional. The women on the right-hand side are portrayed as European women. They're portrayed as white with European-like bodies. And one of the reasons why William Hodges was creating a painting like this is because in the 18th century, one of the goals of these artists was to create images that drew interest in the region. And so to draw interest in the region, artists use European sensibilities or kind of visual aesthetics with Pacific subject matter to make the scenery and the place look appealing and exotic. And another example of this is a painting by John Weber entitled The Portrait of Padua. Now this portrait of Padua is mimicking a classical pose of a Greek classic sculpture entitled Medici Venus. And so if we do a bit of visual analysis, we can see the left arm of Padua is tattooed, whereas the right arm is crossing her body and touching her hip. She holds a fly whisk which is a symbol of her chiefly status. She has gardenias in her ear. She's represented with adolescent breasts and a white cloth covering her lower body. And in the backdrop of this painting is lush tropical foliage, and it's ubiquitous of exotic themes that were circulating Europe during this time. But what is not revealed in this painting is that Padua is a princess of Tahiti, and she was taken hostage together with her father and her brother and husband during the third voyage of James Cook in exchange for 2 sailors that were deserted onto their island. And the hostages were enticed, so Padua and her family were enticed on board of James Cook's ship and imprisoned until her father secured the return of the deserters. So this painting then is used to conceal the violent realities of colonialism at this time. So this painting was created in Tahiti and then sent back to Europe to send a message about the good deeds, the wonderful people that James Cook was encountering, and not the legacies of violence. And just as a reference, we can see in the slide the comparison with Medici Venus and the likeness of the painting of Padua with this classical Greek sculpture. And again, creating an image that would appeal to European audiences, that people would be attracted to and want to look at and want to know more about. But more importantly for this lecture, or just as importantly for this lecture, is something that Margaret Jolly states. She says, "The image of Padua is an intrinsic part of the process of aestheticization of the violence of Cook's voyages. The portraits connected to the colonial spin doctoring, that is, the native body in colonial discourse, served as a method for confirming European dominance and obscured the violence that was occurring between foreigners and Pacific inhabitants." So again, this painting of Padua is masking the violent interactions that were happening during this time as a way of concealing a lot of the interactions that Cook was engaging with. So looking deeper into some of the issues that Marata Tamaira discusses in her article, she discusses the contemporary Polynesian female artists that have been actively complicating the received visual representation of the Polynesianist canon by reappropriating the dusky maiden motif and reinscribing it with fresh and empowering substance. So one example of this is Rosanna Raymond. Rosanna is from Aotearoa, New Zealand. She's a Pacific Islander of Samoan and Pākehā descent, so Pākehā meaning European descent, who has worked in a range of creative media, including costume design, poetry, dance, jewelry making, and multimedia performance art. She's also the founding member of Pacifica Sisters, which is a performance collective based in New Zealand. So looking at one of the images that is in Marata's article entitled Full Tusk Maiden, Rosanna created this image in 1999, and she reworks the image of the dusky maiden in order to change perceptions of who the dusky maiden actually is. So some of the important visual elements, she uses black and white image that's digitally manipulated. dressed in material objects that signify strength, such as pua seeds, boar tusk, and she digitally applies tattoo on the body. The power of her stance is taking the stance of a haka, which is a Maori dance. And so we can see her hands are on her hips, her legs are at a strong stance, and her gaze expresses self-possession, self-sufficiency, and agency. So if we compare it to this image of Padua, we can see a stark contrast between the two images. One that is a bit passive, as Padua is portrayed as, whereas Rosanna is really appropriating this image and taking a strong stance, showing the strength of who the Dusky Maiden is. And so she interprets this image through the concept of va, which is a Samoan term that conveys a liminal space that is marked by ambiguity and transformation. So rather than seeing the Dusky Maiden and Full Tusk Maiden as polar opposites, they are instead two sides of the same coin, flipping back and forth through the transformative space of the va when it suits them. So for her, this image of the Full Tusk Maiden is not meant to be completely resistant against the Dusky Maiden, but rather put in direct conversation, in dialogue, and through this concept of va. And she discusses va a little bit more in the video that I posted on Canvas. And we'll listen to that in a little bit. And then this is another image that she created in 2009, kind of updating her 1999 photo. This one is in color. We can see that strong gaze, that strong stance that she's taking kind of remains consistent in this new image. And on Canvas, I have posted a video that I would like you guys to watch that discusses the Savage Club. And so it is not the Savage Club, but the Savage Club. And so she is playing again on this idea of va. And but she carries it into a new project that is still responding to the colonial images, the portrayal of the Pacific in colonial images, and creating a response. So please watch that video that is posted on Canvas. And then moving into another artist that Marata Tamaira discusses in her article is Shigi Yuki Kihara. She is a Samoan and Japanese descent artist. She grew up partially in Samoa and then also in New Zealand, in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So at age 16, she immigrated to New Zealand and received a diploma in fashion design and technology from Wellington Polytech. And she worked as a fashion stylist and multimedia artist in Aotearoa as well as abroad. So she is one of the first Pacific Island artists to be exhibited in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, which is significant because that museum does not represent many contemporary artists. So she's kind of one of the more well-known artists of the region. And one of her interests is looking at the role of photography and representation of the female body. And so she inverts, so she goes through an archive of different photographs. Primarily for this project, she looks at postcards, and she inverts earlier representation of Polynesian women from the 19th century Western photography. And she reenacts the 19th century photographic representation specifically of Samoan women. And so we can see in this image that is on the slide, the top image is a Samoan woman laying on the ground with tapa and weavings behind her, holding a map, holding a fan, and with no shirt. And below it is Yuki Kihara's rendition of it. So we can see that she's laying on a couch. She has the grass skirt, looking directly at the camera. And so Yuki Kihara's work is not only responding to colonial photography, but she's also kind of in conversation with a lot of other paintings, historical paintings, and photography that is portraying the female nude. So she mimics what she sees in these photographs, and this is an example of one, showing how she kind of gestures to these various poses. But in one particular triptych, she shows exactly how she is taking control of her own body in the image of the photograph. She uses her body to cross the boundaries of the colonial gaze, demolishing the rigid binaries of gender as it is perceived in the Western world. She interrogates the scheme of the Western classification. And so in this triptych, we see three images. Beginning with the one on top, we see that she's laying on the couch with her grass skirt. The second image, the grass skirt comes off and reveals a bit more of her body. And then the third image reveals her genitalia. And so Yuki Kihara is a fa'afafine, and in Samoa that means a third gender. In Western world that might mean transgender, but fa'afafine is very specific to the cultural context of Samoa. It has a very layered meaning that I'm not going to go into for this lecture. But by revealing her genitalia, she's revealing the complexities of gender. And perhaps that there's much more to these bodies than what is portrayed in the images. And lastly, I'd like to talk about the work of Lisa Rehana, In Pursuit of Venus, which is a video work, a moving image work from 2015. And Lisa Rehana responds to the wallpaper Savages of the Pacific that I discussed very briefly earlier. And she recreates it in video form and represents the people of the Pacific as they are represented in this historical wallpaper. So on Canvas, I have a video interview with Lisa Rehana, and I would like you guys to watch that video and learn more about this particular work. But it's very relevant to this topic of responding to the colonial gaze, because she directly interacts with not only the way that Pacific people were represented, but also how colonial figures were represented in a very layered, complicated narrative that's presented in this film. So let's just watch a short clip of the video itself. Also, this installation will be at the De Young Museum during fall quarter, and everyone will receive extra credit if you go and see this installation and then write a response, and I'll have more information about that on Canvas. So let's just watch it. Okay, so lastly, I just want to mention that I have also assigned 2 articles. One of them is by Vilsoni Herenico, Indigenous Knowledge and Academic Imperialism, and the Remembrance of Pacific Past, an Invitation to Remake History. And Vilsoni Herenico is a professor from University of Hawaii Manoa. He previously was at Pacific Island Studies and now is at the Creative Center for Media at the university. And so you can choose either this article or an article by Peli Hauofa, who's a very influential scholar of the Pacific, considered to be the godfather of scholarship, Pacific scholarship in the region. So these 2 articles are available on Canvas, and they will be incorporated into this week's quiz and discussion. And I will end there. Thank you very much for listening, and have a wonderful day. Talk to you soon. Bye.